Thank you. And I'm happy to have Thomas Fritsch with me, because we will switch a little bit within the presentation. I will start to give you a rough overview about Transport Profiler. Maybe you participate the session yesterday of Patrick Boch. He explained Transport Profiler in general, and we will go more in detail. But to give you an overview, we start with the Transport Profiler and how it looks and how it works in the backend. Afterwards, we will go through a couple of test cases, how to customize, how to administrate a test case that it fulfills your requirements. We will have a session regarding the development of your own test case. So if the customizing is not enough and the test case doesn't cover all your requirements, you can also do your own development and to develop transport profiler test cases based on our framework. Maybe, but it depends how far we come with the time, because the session goes a little bit deep. You need the authorization to do development in the system, but we will do it on an example. And at the end, we show how to integrate Transport Profiler into TMS. We have two options, one with workflow and one without. In this session, we show the option to integrate it without the workflow. In the session afterwards, done here by Sebastian Schönhofer, he will do a session and to show the integration of Transport Profiler and Code Profiler in TMS with workflow. And if you have questions, just ask, because we have enough stuff to fulfill the 45 minutes. But if you have questions, just interrupt us and let us discuss, ask, or later on. We also can discuss open points later on. As I said, the agenda, we start with an overview. And maybe you already saw this slide. That's okay. This slide should show that you can protect your system wherever you get a transport from. Where you would like to import a transport, it's the development system, it's into the QA system or in the production. You can use Transport Profiler to protect your system, to get no information or no data in your system without validating them before you import them. Thomas will go more in detail to show you, okay, what kind of stuff you can transport and what you can create with transports in your system. How you can use them to create an attack, or how you can use them to import critical data. So we have, on one side, we have the possibility to use it for external. We did this quite often if you do a test installation customer side, that we validate external third-party products. So if you have a third-party vendor, you install products of them, you can use Transport Profiler to validate the product. Okay, but if you do this in test installation, it's always a surprise for the customer to see, okay, what he really imports in the system. For example, we did this for the last test installation, and we saw that he imported a couple of objects without the referenced packages, for example. And if you have objects in your system without a package, you can do nothing. And if you have, for example, this in the namespace of the third-party provider, then you have to have at least a namespace, and that's another issue. Most of the provider doesn't transfer also the namespace information together with this application. So we find a lot of things during the test installation if we just inspect external transports. That's one thing, and the other thing I would like to show you also in a short demo on the system is to release a transport from the development to QA, that we do also the tests before it goes to QA, that the transport is consistent, that the transport has all the objects in it which are required to get them running on the QA. I hope it's quite easy. We have this possibility to analyze transports before you import them into your system. And for example, before you import an external transport into your development system, We just have to use the data file. This is the R file of the transport request. You select them. You also can select multiple of them. You can also combine them with other transports. You can select here from the input queue or from the directory. And you just have to run the cockpit, and the cockpit will decompress the file in the backend and will analyze all the objects which are part of the transport and will check, okay, what would happen if you import this transport, for example, into your system. Because as you can see, this is a demo transport, it's a quite old transport, and if we would import them into the system, then we would overwrite a lot of objects with an older version, just for an example. And the other thing, as I said, is the possibility to integrate transport, which we will go more in detail later on, to integrate them into the transport organizer. So if you release a transport, it checks in the background, okay, where does this transport go? And we have an ROC defined in the background, and this checks, okay, what would happen if you release these transports and you would import them into the target. So it would check if all the required objects are part of the transport or if something are missing. And because this is an example, okay, you see there are a lot of findings, but I don't want to go in details to the findings because Thomas will explain the test cases. Yes? It checks them by accessing the target system, right? Yeah.
Kind of a simulation.
Yeah. I think we have to mix up between the objects which are on the transport. For example, you transport a report, and the report has a simple function call within. And we are checking if this function is available in the target or if it's part of the transport. That if you import this report into your system, that you can execute the report and it works fine. That's, for example, we also detected with checks of third-party products that they had a couple of function calls within their product which are related to set functions or to customer function, and they of course they were not part of the transport. So this might be because of the coding, no problem. But this is, for me, it's an open question. Is it does this product has the quality I expect, or does it have maybe say even functionality within which gets called and creates a dump at the end? Because a function call, if you import a report and the function call doesn't exist in the system, that's no issue because you can import them. That's from the compiler side, it's okay. But if you execute and you call the function, then you get a dump. So it's a dump you get later. It's not part of the transportation, but it's a problem you have later in the system. Okay, just to give you a small overview, as I said, go back. This is how Transport Profiler works in general. We analyze the transport files if the transport are released. We analyze the information out of the system if the transport is still open, and we access the data out of the system. And one good thing we did together with SAP, or we get great support from SAP side, is a decompression of the transport files are now part of the R3 Trans, and we can use the SAP standard functionality to decompress them, and now we are at least 100 times faster as at the moment. So we also had in discussion with SAP support to improve our functionality. So now it's quite easy if you have a compressed file, if you have a transport file, we decompress it within seconds and we do all the checks in the system. So far to the overview. Any questions? Okay, then I would like to switch over to...
Okay, yes, so first of all, I want to give you some examples because, in my opinion, the transport system is one of the most underestimated source for compromising a target system. Companies invest a lot in security based on network security, backup concept, security department, very complex authorization concepts, but all these things can be just omitted by the transport system. Yeah? And to give you some examples, I have prepared some transport requests with some objects. All of these objects would be found by TransportProfiler. So let's start with the first one here. It's a very small transport request, just one object containing table TOP_off. With this transport, you are able to disable all authorization checks in your production system. Yeah? You can prepare, you see the key inside the transport request is an asterisk. Of course, you would have to prepare that table in your development system. You would have to add all authorization objects in that table in order to export all authorization object information with that table. But as you know, on a development system, it's quite an easy task for a developer just to add entries to a table. So, and one thing is valid for all these examples. Of course, here you have just that one entry, but think about release transports. You have thousands of objects inside these transports. And there it's really hard, even if you have the knowledge about these objects, to detect these objects in such an amount of objects in a release transport. So of course, the effect of this transport would be very, very big. So I think it would be very fast that people recognize something goes wrong in production. As an alternative, you can disable authorization objects for individual transactions. So as an example, I have here PA30, HR, master data. Yeah? If you transport that content into your production system, there is no need for having any authorization anymore in that transaction. Everyone is able to go through the master data HR for any user. Even here, if we have a look on that object that's behind that entry, it's called R3TR-SUSK. You know, even in SAP Standard or in some other tools, you are able to define critical objects. But there's normally more than one method to transport such critical content into production. So each of these transport objects normally consists of different table entries underlying on that object. So if you are a little bit more familiar with the details for that object, you could transport the same thing with just a table entry. So maybe the SUSK object, which is known by some administrators because it's an official transport object, is defined as critical. But I think this table is not that much known by administrators. But it's another possibility of disabling authorization objects for that transaction. So these were 3 examples in the security area. Another example in the robustness domain in TransportProfiler is that we check for transports having key asterisk for tables specified. That's okay for some tables, even SAP records sometimes the complete content of a table for transport. But here, this is an example we already saw at 2 customers. We heard about the problems they had. I don't know, does someone know table TVDIR? Table TVDIR is an administration table that contains all information about your maintenance views that you maintain in transaction SM30. We had 2 events at customers, one at a customer, one at a third-party provider, who accidentally transported that table with key asterisk. Asterisk means I export the complete content of that table out of my development system, and the content in the target system is completely replaced by my content. Now, can you imagine what it means for, let's say, a third-party provider if he exports that table and bring it into the customer's development system? None of the maintenance views can be used anymore because the complete information, the administrative information about maintenance views is completely destroyed. So this is one of the other general test cases that we have. We check for keys which are just asterisk or client asterisk. In some situations it might be okay, but in a lot of situations it's quite critical because people sometimes doesn't know about what does it mean to transport with asterisk. So they must be aware of losing data in the target system. And as a last example, we have one system where we have SNC enabled with single sign-on. It's D66. If I log in here as Peter, you see it's my user, it's user from Peter, and I just have to specify the login language. Now let me just import a very small transport. It's that one here. You will later have a look in that transport. Okay, it's already done. So I log off. And now I log in again. It offers me user substar. And I'm in with substar. What's in that transport? So I log in again with user of Peter. It's even a small transport again, like all the other examples. It's just that one entry. On my development system, D60, I copied the SNC name of Peter to user substar. Substar even doesn't exist on development. I did it just via a two-line report. Yeah? Then I exported that transport and imported it into D66, and I could use that user. Of course, if you use System Profiler also, System Profiler would recommend you to log user substar. Nevertheless, you can do the same thing with all other powerful HR users you have on the system, whoever. Yeah. So you see, it doesn't really need any big experience or effort. It's just a one line in a transport request which can open you the complete system. Maybe we should also mention it. You saw at Peter's slide, we check before export. We check, or normally there is an option to check before the import into production. And both are really needed, both checks, because we have some experts at Virtual Forge which were able to not only decompress the data file, they injected objects into the data file, and afterwards they imported it into the production system. And there you see it's quite really important to do also a check right before production. It's not really encrypted, the data file by SAP. There's only a checksum, but these guys were able to just adapt the checksum so that it fits again. It's a very common algorithm which is used by SAP there. So they were able really to inject everything they want. Of course, if you want to insert manually some complex objects, it would need more knowledge. But putting in a simple table entry is quite an easy task there. Yeah. So all these examples we saw here are covered, of course, by test cases in Transport Profiler. Currently, it's on our agenda to detect manipulated files. Our current philosophy is if the customer does a check right before the import into production, we would detect these table entries also. Yeah? And the check before import into production is needed for other reasons too, because maybe we switch to the slide, we do not only check for transport content related to security aspects. Another big area is a part of robustness. So we check for missing referenced objects. Are some of the objects a report that I want to import into production? Are some of these objects which are referenced by that report are missing in production? Yeah. And of course, this makes sense also to check right before the import into production. Normally you have maybe 100 or 500 transport requests in a bunch, and all the missing objects are in other transport requests of that set. So it makes sense to check this bunch of transport requests together to get no false positives. Another aspect is long-running database table conversions. So if, depending on changes on a table, on a database table, the table needs to be converted on a database. During that time, the table is locked and no application that needs to access that table will work anymore. So based on our risk assessments, which will Peter explain a little bit later, we saw already customers with table conversions which took more than 1 hour. If it's a very large table, it may even take several hours. So we will show you this aspect, and then you can, for example, schedule the respective transport for the weekend or for out of business hours, so that there is no danger of a hanging application. We check for downgrades. That's also something we saw in our risk assessments. We there scan the history of all transports at a customer, and nearly all customers, they have currently downgrades. That means they already had newer versions of their object in production than currently, because they were overwritten by an older transport. We have that section for rule violations and business impact. So yeah, most of them I already showed. There are other security-related test cases. For example, you can transport role or profile assignments to users, which is normally done by central user administration. Nevertheless, you can transport a profile or a role that is assigned to a user on development by a transport into production. There is also an official way of doing that. Nevertheless, it's not recommended. And there's also a non-compliant way of doing that by just transporting the respective tables again into production. All these occurrences of these tables are normally an evidence for that someone has manipulated the transport request. He has inserted data to the object list, either manually or even programmatically. That's normally not an official transport object. SAP has a bunch of, let's say, 100, 150 tables which cannot be stored at a transport. It's really checked hard-coded. They are all listed in a function module before you release a transport request. So you cannot insert that objects manually in SE10, but you can do it again via other programming. You can put them into the transport request. You can even trigger the export of the corresponding transport request. So you see, you can do nearly everything in the transport system. You can imagine that there are some situations where you want to handle SAP transports, third-party transports, different compared to your own internal transports. So we have a bunch of test cases where we check if application data is transported, data for system table is transported, and there it depends really on the originator of a transport request. Is it third party, is it SAP, is it my own? To define the rules and also to provide the corresponding test case result. There are sometimes other rules valid for SAP transport than for my own transport. Or a lot of customers, if they get third-party transports, they give us an Excel sheet with up to 150 requirements. Your transport must not contain these objects. It must not contain modifications. It must not contain data to SAP tables. So with the classification here, you are able to define rules for your test cases depending on whether it's a third-party transport, SAP, or internal transport. The same can be done by the namespace owner. I have different roles for objects, not only for transports, but for objects of a third-party provider than for my own objects. Okay, just for the customizing, because of the limited time frame, just before we start the session where Peter gives you just a quick insight in how to develop your own checks in TransportProfiler. For a lot of the existing out-of-the-box test cases, you can really adapt the test case to your needs just by customization. Yeah? Do you want to allow table logging, for example, for application tables, so tables of delivery class application, which you shouldn't? But do you also want to extend that to tables of other delivery classes? That's just one example. I guess the most generic test cases are the ones for checks on critical objects or critical table contents. There, whenever you detect in your environment an object where you say that's really critical in my environment, you just put it on the list of critical objects. You can assign an own document that will be provided to the auditor who starts the inspection and who gets the finding for that object. And you can also do that with table content, with table data, even based on a key level. It's just not that you say this table is critical. You can just exclude a key or a key range, which in your environment might be critical.
I would give you a short impression how to implement your own test case. You will find on the slides a couple of information additional to what you get in the system if you install TransportProfiler. But I don't want to go through the slides because of the time. I think we have a look to the real system. So let's go to. I think this is right on. Okay, there is one section where you can go through step by step to develop your own test case. Of course, first you have to think about, okay, which object you would like to test, which information you would like to extract, which information you may need from the target system or from the transport object to do all your checks and your validation. But this is all available by the framework. So, for example, if you say, I would like to check the information of a data element, you can say, okay, I develop a test case for data element or for a group of data elements, because you also can include the main object and the sub-object. And then you get functionality, more like a library, you can use to extract information. And this information you can extract, as I said, from a transport request, independent if it's an open request or if it's a closed request or released, or from the target system. That you have all information available to do all your checks and to compare the information and provide the user the result. So let's have a look. There's a description. We moved the description from our documentation into SAP because we say, okay, the developer may have no access to our PDF documentation. So we put it all, let's say, here inside, and you find within this description all the information. The information, but also related to the interfaces. I move through like for this information, if you develop a test case, you have to provide some functionality for different methods, and you get an explanation based on the interface for all the different methods you have to implement. So that's the first step. You can start to get an overview, okay, what to do to implement a test case. To make it easy, we deliver an example class which you can use to copy this class. You just have to uncomment a couple of source lines, like here. Let's have a look. You see here, this is all comment. You just have to uncomment them, and you can do the customizing for the test case, and then you can run this test case like a hello world test case to see how it works, to see how to retrieve data from the different sources, to see how to provide the information to do a result assessment later on, and what you can do to provide the information to display this to the user at the end. I don't want to go in details because it's, as I said, if you do a test installation of Transport Profiler, for example, you all have this in place, and it's quite easy to say, okay, make a copy, uncomment, do a couple of customizing where we can go through. You define your test case group, as I said. For this example I will show, we have done this for the data element. And I said, okay, I would like to run this test case for data element objects and for the limo objects of the data element. So whenever a data element is on the transport or a limo object is on the transport for a data element, then this test case gets called and gets executed. You have to create your documentation. It just show you, okay, this is how it looks like. It's of course it's a dialog text, and you can put in the text as you know within SAP, and you have the possibility also to set here some variables and to fulfill them, to provide these variables if you execute a test case. At the end, if you have the documentation and you have the development, you can define your test case. It's just by putting the test case, give them a title. You have a number range, 9, zeros, and so on, to develop as much as you like. You have to assign the test case class, the documentation, that's all. And if you execute it, we do it here in an example. It looks like, do this here. Okay, I have here this transport. So it looks like this. No, come on. On this transport, we have a data element, and this checks if the data element and the referenced domain has the same package assignment. This is what this test case does. So it detects all the information in the source or in the target system. It provides the documentation, as you can see here on the right-hand side, and here you see dynamic information based on that what would be provided by the test case. That's, as I said, that's more or less copy-paste to get a first impression to see how the framework works, and then you are able to extend this to all the other objects which are possible to transport. Just to give you a short impression. No, I think Andreas, you are looking to the time, but I see. Okay, the last thing is Tms integration. As I said, two possibilities. One with workflow will be shown by Sebastian Schönhofer in a couple of minutes. The other one is to do it without workflow. This is also quite simple. It's also a description within our IMG that you have to implement this CTS request check party. And you can like in the test case, you can copy the source code provided by us into your own body and activate this, and Transport Profiler will be activated in the background, and whenever you release a task, Transport Profiler will do all the checks for the transport objects you like to export and import them into QA. I know that was fast, but I think we have time afterwards to discuss and to go through a couple of questions. But if you have right now questions.
Yeah, any questions from your side? No, a question from my side. I know that we had a big project not far away from here, and in this project we developed a lot of transport test cases. How many?
I think it was around about 20, 25.
20? Okay.
20 test cases. It was customer-specific requirements, so whatever is general, of course, we will take over and provide the test case also in our tool. But if it's customer-related, pure customer-related, then of course then it will be done by the customer. But what I would like to extend to attach is also, of course, like Thomas Fritsch said, we are doing risk assessments. So we scan the history of your transports to see, okay, what happened in the past. And as we said, we had some surprises at customer, like this TV star we detected at one customer. But what is also possible to do a test installation, which is, just to give it a chance to inspect external transports and see, okay, what you are going or what you import into your system, what you did in the past or what you would like to do in the future. Two options you can use.
Thank you very much. It's also like we started to develop the Transport Profiler because customers had this very bad experience of system downtime for a day, and you can imagine what happens if a big customer is down for a day and cannot produce goods anymore. So really the first customer who asked for, they had the bad experience. So perhaps we are now able to find the customer and protect him, or let's say the customer, before such bad things are really happening, like a hack or a system downtime. No, it's not part of the Code Profiler, it's a separate product. It is part of the Virtual Forge suite, which contains of Code Profiler, System Profiler, and Transport Profiler, and it's completely independent. So the license is independent, but the product itself as well. In the next session, we see that from time to time we have a link between two products, and this is what happens in the next session, the combined workflow of Transport Profiler and correct?
Yeah,
and
Code Profiler.
Code Profiler for ABAP.